Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Fiber for Breakfast. We're now in our 34th episode of 2022. But before we kick off, I'd like to thank our sponsors of Fiber for Breakfast, including our gold sponsors, Graybar and Vetro. Yesterday, the Fiber Broadband Association held its latest regional event at the Copper Mountain Resort in Colorado. We had a record crowd, and it was an amazing event. Some of the highlights included hearing from Brandy Reeder, the Colorado State Broadband Director. Sarah Smith from NTI walked us through all the NTI programs, including the $42 billion BEAD program. And Tony Neal Graves from the Governor's Office and the Colorado State Chief Information Officer provided some great perspective on where Colorado has, where it started and where they are now. I also really enjoyed Jeff Ryman's panel on the Colorado Springs utility fiber deployment with Brian Worthinger of Colorado Springs Utilities and Amal Natick of Ting. Our next regional Fiber Connect workshop is in Columbus, Ohio on November 3rd. Don't miss it, so register today. In Washington yesterday, 14 Republican senators sent a letter to Secretary Raimondo and NTIA on the BEAD NOFO. While the letter applauded the NTIA BEAD NOFO, it highlighted some areas of concern, which included rate regulation, preference for non-traditional broadband providers, workforce preferences, and unnecessary burdens on the NTIA review process. Unfortunately, these senators included a plea for technology neutral, indicating that any technology such as cable, fixed wireless, two cans and a string should be eligible for BEAD as long as they can deliver reliably 100 by 20. It's really disappointing these senators have been misguided and don't understand that we are building the critical broadband infrastructure for generations to come. If this $42.45 billion becomes a race to the bottom, as we saw with the billions that were spent on the FCC CAP programs, then we'll continue to be in this perpetual cycle of subsidizing the same locations over and over again. Let's talk about a segment of the market that clearly understands what it takes to build the infrastructure of the future. I'm excited about today's Fiber for Breakfast session, as electric utilities are the fastest growing segment of the broadband market. And today's session is Rock Down to Electric Avenue, Electric Utilities and Their Role in Broadband Expansion with my friend Scott Pell from FiberRise. But before I formally introduce today's guests, I'd like to introduce Trish Ehlers from our team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thanks, Gary, and good morning to everyone who's joined us this morning. Before I go over a few logistical items, I'd like to once again thank our Fiber for Breakfast sponsors, Graybar and Vetro. Now, if you'd all keep in mind that everyone is in listen mode only, to ask a question, you can just type it into the question box located within your control panel on the right side of your screen. We'll host a Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's session. This presentation is being recorded and will be available to members only on FBA's website within 24 hours. You can find the recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a very brief feedback survey. If you just take a minute to do so, we really appreciate your input. And now I'll pass it back to Gary to get us started and introduce our panelists. Gary?
Thanks, Trish, and good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week at the Fiber for Breakfast, we discussed connecting all, how digital literacy is critical for mental health, with Dr. John Torres and Noy Alon from Harvard. I am amazed and excited to see how health practitioners are leveraging broadband and developing targeted applications to significantly improve patient outcomes. Today, we're going to shift gears back to talk about fiber broadband providers and one of the most important market segments, the electric utility providers, in a session titled Rock Down Electric Avenue, Electric Utilities and Their Role in Broadband Expansion with my friend Scott Pell from FiberRise. Scott Pell is the Vice President of Quality at FiberRise and has over 25 years of broadband experience, primarily in underserved areas. Scott has the expertise in forging relationships across the industry to serve the broader marketplace. He joined FiberRise as a Vice President of Quality He leads the process improvement, quality, scaling initiatives for the company. In January, Scott will take over the role of Vice President of Operations. Previously, Scott served as the Division CTO for NRTC Broadband Solutions, where he led the scaling efforts to support rapid growth. Before that, he founded API Digital in Huntsville and was focused on building, operating, and supporting networks for underserved areas, including Huntsville at the time. That company was acquired by NRTC in 2017. So welcome, Scott, and please type in your questions and comments as we go, and we'll work them into the Q&A at the end. With that, I'll turn it over to Scott.
Morning. Thank you, Gary. So the one thing that you and I did not do is come up with a good one-hit wonder like Eddie Grant did with Rock Down to Electric Avenue. In fact, my mission success there was to get it stuck in your team's head, and I think we got that done. And I believe the entire audience now has that song stuck in their head. So we did good. So thanks for having me on. I wanted to take a brief second just to explain who FiberRise is. So we've been involved with building fiber optic networks for electric power utilities since our inception. We do funding, feasibility, design, project management, all that stuff to make it happen. A couple weeks ago, we were acquired by Entrust Solutions Group. I went to bed with 108 teammates and woke up with 3,000 teammates the next day. They are very, very strong in the electric power industry, particularly in grid modernization, and we're going to touch on some of that as we work through the various different levels of mission that our customers have. So glad to be here and glad to represent a nice, good organization. If you can flip back one, I think that it's, yep, there you go. So Entrust has been around for 20 years. A couple things that kind of struck me, we've got 1,400 design personnel involved with electrics, 2,700 employees company-wide in all facets of the power and gas industry. So that is going to play very, very well in helping us bring electric utilities in creating a utility-based broadband network, either to serve their particular mission or to serve customers throughout the country. So, all right, let's jump into the next slide there. Sorry. So I shamelessly stole this from you guys, Gary, in the research that your team did together with RVA. There's a bunch of fiber still to be built. If you switch to the next slide there, pretty much over the next 5 years, we have to build more than what has already been built to date. Now, some of that's going to be, overbuilding and eating each other's young from a broadband perspective, but there's a large portion of the country that is not served right now, and I feel very confident that the electric power utilities are going to be key in making that happen. So there's a long pole in the tent of work to get done, and when you can switch to my next slide there, everyone kind of starts trying to figure out, with the level of funding that's available, how are we going to get this done? These are major projects. A lot of the underserved at this point are very, very difficult to get to. A lot of, when we talk about broadband, we talk 100 homes per mile, 50 homes per mile. When we start talking cooperative, we're lucky to get 20 homes per mile, and then as you get further out, you're lucky to get 3 or 4 homes per every 10 miles. So this we're getting to the part where we're starting to work through the harder to reach items. So how do we get this done, and how do we make all this math work? So on the next slide, just to serve a little color here, Gary and I were part of a group in Huntsville when the mayor was trying to figure out how do we serve a very, very high-tech community, when the best we could get was 384K DSL. You know, Gary worked for a high-tech company at that point. We were all like, hey, you know, how come we're leading the nation in innovation and trailing the nation in being able to send an email about that innovation? So as we all introduced ourselves around the table, I was sitting next to Jay Stowe, who is CEO of Huntsville Electric. I was able to say, hey, glad to see that I've got several customers around the room and we're all coming together and figuring out how we can get this done. And Jay, right after me, said, well, I'm glad to see that pretty much everyone in the room is my customer and we're working together to get this done. And we all kind of laughed. It's like, well, you know, Jay has a brilliant point here. Everyone that wants to get electric power is served with electric power all across the country. And this is a dated graphic. It really hasn't changed, forgive the graininess, but there's 3 distinct segments covering the country. The investor-owned large power utilities, the publicly owned municipalities around the country, and then the electric cooperatives. I've worked in both the cooperative and publicly owned space, and then our Entrust team has a very, very strong footprint in the investor-owned. So with the organization we have now, we get to work in all 3 of these segments. The reason why this is important in my mind for broadband is these companies are used to making, number one, significant generational investments. You know, they understand the importance of a significant investment in a long-term asset, for one, but they also have to pay attention to resiliency and restoration and tracking those assets. So a utility, when they spend money, it has to be on a 20 to 40 to 50 year trajectory that they're trying to put themselves on, because they have to stay way ahead of it. As communities grow, they've got to have the proper investment to deliver power. As power becomes more expensive or the utilization gets higher, they've got to be able to match that. And as people move out, they've got to figure out, okay, how do I keep paying for this thing? So utilities have to have a very long look at this, and that's why I think they're key in this whole discussion. When we're looking at the 3 segments, go ahead and switch to the next one. I think the important thing to think about with the different segments is what their focus is. And I'm gonna start from the right to the left. So the electric co-ops were founded as a means to get to the under and unserved. You know, originally the bigger power companies were in the cities, and the cooperatives were a lot of times groups of farmers that came together and made an investment in an infrastructure to get power out to the kind of the heart of America. So the cooperatives are used to innovation. They've been around for over 100 years in many cases, and they've had to figure out how to make do. And over the years, they've become a lot more savvy in investment planning. So as the broadband revolution to rural America kind of took place, the power co-ops were very attuned to coming up with 20, 40, $100 million to make this happen. But they also have the same concerns as all the other power companies. I've listed a few out: grid modernization, asset management, service restoration, green power, and microgrid. If you think about it, a co-op might be a version of a microgrid to a big investor-owned company. You know, they take care of a smaller area. That takes me over to the publicly owned. This is the municipalities. I do see a lot of partnerships between the co-ops and the municipalities. A lot of co-ops surround some smaller cities, and those cities might have their own utility. And there are lots of partnerships going on, not only with our clients, but we see it across the country. As a co-op starts building, the munis are first ones going, hey, we'll have what you're having. Let's work out a pole attach agreement. Let's get our community served. A lot of times those mayors are the first ones that show up in line. So a publicly owned municipality is focused on community development. They have to serve their under and unserved as well as any constituents that are within their area. So they don't get to pick and choose. It's wherever the city limits are that they've got to facilitate. But they've got the same strategies to focus on. Their challenge is the bigger the city gets, we start running into issues on, well, what's our real focus here? So, and broadband may not be part of it. It may be growth. It may be continuing to serve it. They may be in a city that's in a downhill slide. So the municipalities have their own things that they have to deal with. So, and then we move over to the left on the investor-owned. Most investor-owned companies, I know Southern Company, in particular Alabama Power, are focused on economic development. You know, they build and grow the community. They're going to grow their service footprint. They're going to grow their capabilities along with it. If you think about it, you know, a big power company only grows when more people come and use more power. So, you know, they are all focused on developing the areas that they're within. And then they have all these other focuses here. One thing we notice about the investor owns is they're usually the first ones in the room to figure out, okay, how do we work together? Many of those investor owns actually generate and transmit the power to the municipals and the cooperatives. So they all have to work together hand in glove. And together, all these organizations, I tried to look for some good statistics on what's been spent. And, you know, it's trillions of dollars in developmental infrastructure. So when we turn to broadband, we've got to you can go back to that original one. That's my, there you go. When we look at broadband, the conversations change throughout those three organizations. The cooperatives are focused on broadband. Their constituents are asking for it. Anybody who even thinks about it, they get overwhelming support. These folks are getting 50 and 60 and 70% take rates in areas. So the broadband discussion is wide open in the co-ops. In the municipals, maybe broadband is on the agenda. On the smaller ones, it definitely is. On the big ones, it could be that accidental career change button for a CEO of a municipal, because they also have other contenders that are already attached to their polls. So that one, you have to understand your environment. And then for an investor owned, I'll be honest with you, broadband is Fight Club. They have very specific items in which a fiber broadband network could be to their own internal benefit, to improve the grid, to be able to do rapid service restoration, to do demand and revenue balancing, so that broadband network can be used for their power generation and management purposes. And oh, by the way, if we want to talk broadband, cool, we'll enable you to do it. But you know, most CEOs aren't going to hit that button. If they can develop a robust fiber network and then other people can use it, Fight Club. So that's kind of where I see the layout of where everyone falls. You can switch to the last slide there. So this is just kind of a quick overview of, you know, where everyone falls. You know, cooperatives and municipalities generally operate as nonprofits. They serve their communities. One other advantage that utilities have, they have excellent GIS data. In fact, I would say if you pulled all the electric data together, we might have a really good source for maps for NTIA and the FCC. One day, maybe somebody will ask for that. As I had stated before, they have large long-term asset bases, and they can borrow against that. CFC is the co-op that does lending. CFC has one of the best financial ratings of any organization in the country because they always pay their loans back. So cooperatives and municipals with bonding and loans generally pay everything back. So, and then really probably the last and most important thing really is they're all used to generational investments. And in order to get done what we're all here for, this is a generational investment. These are dollars that startup broadband companies would have difficulty putting together. You know, the billions of dollars that are in BEAD, that's a great start, but we know that it's going to take 3-4 times that amount just to get out. The folks that can do it are the utilities. They're used to doing utility. In fact, we coined the term utility grade broadband to service all the needs of a power company. those folks, to your point, Gary, they know how to put together a solid network, and they know how to spend the money to make it happen. So that's kind of my take on this whole thing.
Well, thanks, Scott. So we got some questions coming in. Let me start with, to what extent does RUS encourage its borrowers to take advantage of electric broadband synergies?
Well, so electric power companies have been involved with RUS since its founding, pretty much. So one thing I'm pleased about, granted, how you have to do your reporting and stuff is a little bit different between the two, the broadband side and the electric power side. RUS is a level playing field for everybody to operate within. The power companies do leverage it. Sometimes the reporting requirements on RUS is stringent to the point where folks have a little bit of an allergy to it. But RUS is definitely a way to get some things started. But I'll be honest with you, you got to be very intentional about going forward with the project. We like to recommend, hey, let's figure out how to do this thing with no funding. Let's use standard loans if possible. And then if we get a hold of good low interest RUS loans or get some grants and funding and stuff like that, that's just icing on the cake. And that's how you have to think on a generational type investment. Let's use this money to go after this little pocket here, but let's make it part of the bigger picture. That's how, that's why I gotta keep it in perspective.
Yeah, I think, Chris McLean, when I had him on Fiber for Breakfast, he was indicating that that rural utilities were using their electric money to build out broadband, that actually more of its electric funding was going to broadband. And even when speeds were at 4.1, the rural electric community was building out fiber. So the rural electric co-ops have been kind of ahead of the curve.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. So, the backbones that these folks build, they have to use it. They're connecting up their substations to start. So, they're using it as a method to be the platform. So, grid modernization, connecting up their networks, but also, we already know that we don't know the limits of fiber. So being able to slice it a couple different ways so we can achieve other objectives. That's how the cooperatives have generally approached it. It's a brilliant plan. And cooperatives, they're there to serve their constituents, not just with power. Broadband, gas, water, whatever their constituents need, they're going to figure out a way to do it. So
there's a little over 900 rural electric co-ops, and a little over 200 are deploying broadband today. So why wouldn't all 900 be deploying broadband?
That's a great question. Some of the co-ops do have limited territories, particularly out in the West, where you've got literally 5 to 10 miles between homes. So sometimes it's cost prohibitive. I think it also depends on where their leadership is in their career. If you're on the sunset of your career, do you make a generational investment? Is this a good legacy or a bad legacy? Generally, I think the early adopters have come through. I think the next stage, the next 30% are going to rely on working together with others. I think you'll start seeing some pull together. So I think they're waiting on some strength in numbers. And then the last third, they may have to have some new blood in to go, all right, I'll push that button.
Well, it's funny, you mentioned Jay Stowe. I remember when we were, saying, Jay, why don't you build out the fiber network? And, he said, hey, I'm the CEO of a utility, so I'm conservative by definition. Yeah. And it wasn't until, Google came in and said, hey, if you build it, we'll pay you, for all the dark fiber.
Oh, yeah. Well, and Jay's very focused on the mission of his company, and his company today. He works for an investor-owned company, and they have a strong directive to build a network to support their electric operations. That's their mission, and that's why I put mission focused on that last slide, because honestly, when you're running an organization, you're paid by your constituents and your board to accomplish the mission. And that's the one thing I certainly applaud Jay for. He's very, very focused on accomplishing that mission, whatever it might be. So yeah, he did an excellent job.
One of the questions that came in is, what is one of the biggest unexpected expenses you've seen as an electric co-op, after about 2 years of deploying broadband service?
Yeah, with any project, the more zeros you add, the more problems that you run into. I feel like, the early adopters probably ran through a bunch of the problems early on. So I think the biggest deficit that people run into is maybe the operational cost of getting started. Trying to make sure that you have enough people. And this is true in any startup business. You try to run it lean, and then you realize, okay, we're not doing a great job, so we have to spend a little bit more on the operations to get it up to the same kind of level that we already have the electric plant at. So I think it's investing in the right number of people tends to be a surprise to them, because it is a good bit different from their existing model. It's hard to transition their folks into talking both. So that's probably the biggest expense, is making sure you have enough people to support them.
If this was a few years ago, I remember Bruce Purdy always would say that the biggest issue was offering video. And so, basically saying, don't offer video because your call center would be lit up like a, Christmas. But, so now that I think most of them are offering over the top, right? They're not offering video anymore.
Oh yeah. Early on, I worked with a bunch of telephone companies that put significant investments in head ends, and then Hulu shows up and it's like, okay, we might have found the easy button. This over the top is definitely the way to go. Building a big head end to support the content providers. The most expensive part of that is not necessarily building out the capital expense, it's paying everybody afterwards. So now that YouTube TV and Hulu and all those other entrants are in there, you just provide a really, really good broadband network, and you can pick whatever TV content provider you want to. So yes, we rarely have anybody ask, and if they ask, we go, let's introduce you to a few people that would say, let's not do that.
So one of the comments that just came in was, any comments on the proposed bill in Congress that promotes the use of co-ops for broadband infrastructure? So I don't know if they're talking about IIJA, the bill signed into law, where it is, promoting, it is a lot more favorable to non-traditional providers.
I haven't read the bill. But I'm sure my colleague Mike Dunn is already dug into it. I rely heavily on his opinion. He is our director of funding, and he knows all his stuff. I will say this: a lot of the funding has not shown favor to the non-traditional providers. In fact, it leans to the traditional providers, which a lot of times have not made the proper investment. So, even if we give them money, are they going to make the proper investment? Anything that would be more favorable for the non-traditional providers is a plus. We know we have to also wade through the folks that don't necessarily use fiber. That's always going to be a challenge when you start talking about non-traditional providers. But anything that would level that playing field at least would be advantageous. But I'll be honest with you, municipals and co-ops are used to unlevel playing fields. That's a lot of times why they've had to be built, because they had to go fill a gap. So,
well, speaking of gaps, one of the questions is, what are your top three recommendations or actions for both utilities and telecom providers to reduce the gap between these two worlds?
Ooh, okay. Top three, huh? Okay, well, I think more meetings and discussions understanding why we're doing this. In my brain, access to information and education, all the things that broadband allows us to do to bring our country closer together, I think is critical for our continued growth. I think it's critical to our economy. I think it's also critical to our defense. So we got to all remember why we're doing this, number one. That may or may not happen. Gary, I think your organization is very, very well timed because you put those same people in the room. And I think it's very, very important to remind people why we're all here. So that's number one. Number two, I do think leveling that playing field kind of forces everybody to start talking a little bit. Now, I've got friends in the telecom industry. Both are very successful young CEOs, and they've done a wonderful job partnering up with co-ops around them. And they apparently didn't read the book on how nobody works together. They've done a great job partnering up. So that kind of takes me to my third one. I think sharing those practices on how to be partners together, I think is super important. You know, that last third of co-ops, you know, and maybe the folks sitting on the fence, do they really want to run a broadband network? And if that's what's holding them back, we need our service providers that know how to run one to come in, leave their agenda aside for a minute and figure out, okay, how can we work together? I'll run it. You go get the money to build it, and then let's come up with something equitable so we can serve all these people. That is the ticket to get a lot of this stuff done. And Eric and Jonathan, my two friends, have done a great job doing that. So.
Well, you know, we've seen awesome public-private partnerships. You know, Huntsville Utilities and Google Fiber. Yesterday, we had the Colorado Springs Utilities and Ting. So there is a great way for experienced providers to help out utilities if they don't want to have to stand up that part of business. Hey, Scott, we're out of time, but thank you so much. We appreciate all the work that you and FiberRise are doing to help the utilities launch broadbands to the communities they serve. That's what I love about utilities is they are focused on the communities they serve, and broadband is about people. Yeah, so I look forward to joining for you guys getting back together again next Wednesday. We're going to be discussing new evidence. The end-to-end fiber broadband is changing lives with the Fiber Broadband Association's Technology Committee, led by Chair John George from OFS, Mike Render of RVA, and the Fiber Broadband Association's VP of Research, Debbie Kish. So you're not going to want to miss that. We'll see you guys again next Wednesday. Thanks again, Scott. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, Gary.